Welcome to FRE Lunch, the official podcast of the Food and Resource Economics Department at the University of Florida. I'm Elena Poulin, the Marketing and Communications Specialist for the department.
And I'm Caleb Stair, Assistant Instructional Professor of Food and Resource Economics and the Coordinator for Undergraduate Research in the department, meaning I get to interact regularly with the members of our UF community and see all the cool and interesting topics being explored.
That's why we made this podcast, to showcase the many ways students and faculty are using research to understand and address the complex issues facing agricultural and natural resource industries.
In 2025, there's lots of interesting issues that economics can be applied to, but that's only one faucet of the whole solution.
To get the complete picture on one of these issues, we're teaming up with the UF Water Institute and new co-host Sarah Mark for a deep dive into the fathoms of Florida's fresh water.
Hi, I'm Sarah Mark, the Communications and Events Specialist for the Water Institute. Essentially, we serve as a connector between collaborators across the university and beyond.
From precipitation to perception, today we kick off this very special season of FRE Lunch with our friends from the UF Water Institute.
That's right. We'll focus on treading water and shedding some light into the depths of Florida's fresh water.
And there is a lot of it. Florida has about 11 million acres of fresh water.
This includes things like lakes, rivers, and springs like Weehewachee, where you can go and enjoy the mermaid show.
But some of that water is underground. That is known as an aquifer, and it is water that is contained under the ground in a geological formation.
This water is important for many reasons, including fun stuff like tourism-related activities, water skiing, visiting the springs.
And, the super necessary stuff too.
Right, like drinking water. That's what this season is all about, though. As we continue, we will explore many of these topics in depth with a range of experts. And to christen this season off and get the lay of the lake, we are joined by Dr. Matt Cohen, the director of the UF Water Institute. So can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
I'm a double gator. I had got my master's and my PhD here at the University of Florida, so I'm honored to be on the faculty and now directing the Water Institute. I came to the University of Florida after a degree in environmental engineering. Environmental engineering was a way to sort of scratch my more or less lifelong interest in sort of environmental systems and maybe particularly aquatic systems. I got very interested in water treatment. I grew up overseas, and so a lot of the things that I learned here at the University of Florida and the College of Engineering were very native and germane to that. And that's just really kind of translated into the mission of the Water Institute.
Were you always interested in water? How did you know that you wanted to join the field that you were in?
I think like a lot of young people, I didn't know that there was such a thing as an environmental engineer or as a hydrologist. But yeah, I've always been interested in water. I grew up around water, spent a lot of time as a kid playing in streams and in lakes and, fishing and just sort of enjoying the aesthetic attributes of water. I was also a swimmer my whole life. In fact, all through college. And so I had a sort of affinity, spent a lot of time in the water. But I think the main thing that got me interested in water is I did my high school years in Nepal, in Kathmandu, Nepal, and the river that runs through the downtown of Kathmandu is severely polluted. And I saw both a lot of innovation of people trying to solve those problems with regard to plastic pollution, with regard to disease prevention. And I got very interested in the idea of using sort of low-tech solutions for providing support for rural communities, especially in the developing world. And so that really became my passion as an undergraduate. I did a lot of work with the technology known as treatment wetlands, a sort of low-tech technology for mitigating a lot of the contamination associated with wastewater. And that became sort of a launching pad for thinking about water more broadly. So I do think I've been interested in water forever. What that's meant has gotten, there's been different flavors of that the older I've gotten. But I think the core instinct was always that these are important places that we as humans have an obligation to be good stewards of.
Could you provide a brief overview of freshwater in Florida?
Florida is a very watery place. You don't have to be here long to know that we have a very long coastline. We've got a lot of magnificent lakes. In fact, there's 8,800 lakes in the state. We have one of the most productive aquifers on Earth, the Floridan aquifer. And so water is all around us. It's also sort of touches every aspect of the way that we live, from the ways that we recreate and the health and safety of the water that comes out of the tap to the value of water for growing food. And so, big part of, for me, of why this podcast season is so compelling is that it really, documents the many ways in which people who are expert in many domains, disciplines of knowledge sort of think about water.
One of the things that makes Florida's situation unique is that while other areas didn't have enough water, Florida had too much.
And so Florida historically was not a place that people lived because it was forbiddingly difficult to make a livelihood here where there was just so much standing water. And so the early Floridians were deeply motivated by reducing the amount of water in the state, getting rid of it to the extent that they could, managing it so that it was compatible with things like cities and farm fields and whatnot. So that's partly what makes Florida unique, is that we have heavily managed our water in ways that are different from the way that other states manage water. A lot of our engineering enterprise has gone into draining.
But where does all that water come from? Well, to understand that, you need to understand the hydrological cycle.
The hydrological cycle is a sort of infinite loop, right? It's continuously recycling water from the ocean to the atmosphere to the land to underneath the land in aquifers. And it's, Florida has, the same hydrologic cycle that exists everywhere, which is to say that there's a lot of rainfall. The ultimate source of every drop of fresh water that Floridians use is water that fell out of the sky. But how that water makes its way from being a raindrop to being water in your tap, or water that supported a crop, or water that sustained an estuary in which you love to fish, that story is a very complicated one, and one that requires a lot of deep expertise to manage well. And in particular, it has to do with where the water resides. And so one of the key features of Florida's watery existence is the karst aquifer that underlays the entire state. It's called, in fact, the Floridan aquifer. It actually runs all the way from South Carolina to Alabama, and it's an aquifer that lives inside limestone rocks. And I say lives intentionally. It is an ecosystem full of organisms and full of a history.
While water storage might be complicated, it is also essential.
I don't think there's any argument that it is the most important natural resource in the southeastern United States. It is the basis of essentially the water supply for almost all of our cities. It's the basis of our agricultural productivity. It is the foundation of the ecosystems that make Florida feel like home. And so consequently, how we manage it, how we steward it are really instrumental to our collective ethos about the Florida we want to protect.
With that much water, there has to be a myriad of issues that come along with it. One of those, according to Matt, is drainage. While people have certainly lived in Florida for thousands of years, we really started to see a boom in our population when there were big projects to drain water off of the land.
Drainage has always been a big issue, as we have realized that the consequences of a lot of our drainage has been to undermine and compromise a lot of the ecological functions that we collectively view as our birthright. Floridians, we inherited this incredible watery place, and we would like to hand it off in, as unaltered a state as we can to our children. I think the drainage has become a bit of a problem, and that drainage is now part of the management effort, is to balance the needs of cities and coastal infrastructure with the ecological needs of protecting Florida.
As Dr. Cohen said, these drainage innovations have turned Florida into the fastest growing state. Consequentially, the demand for fresh water has grown as well. Today, Florida uses about 6.5 billion gallons of water daily, most of it sourced from the Florida aquifer.
All of those things have emerged as issues in the last 25 or 30 years as we've realized that the water supplies that to the early Floridian settlers were, for all intents and purposes, infinite. Right? The springs were essentially infinite, but we've realized that that's actually untrue, and that we can alter the nature of the Floridan aquifer. We can alter the nature of our surface water storages in ways that are problematic because we use too much water in some places and we dispose of water poorly in other places.
So that's the state of Florida's water quantity. But what about water quality?
The water quality figures really prominently because the consequences of impaired water quality are mutually disastrous in many cases. There's one particular algal bloom in 2018 in Southwest Florida that is judged to have exerted a $2 billion impact on Florida's economy. Just one algal bloom, one summertime. And so because these are important, because tourism is such a big part of our business model, and because our natural environment is a big part of that tourism attraction, water quality has really emerged as a major issue. We don't, generally speaking, in Florida have some of the water quality issues that you hear about in the news, like Flint, Michigan. We have mostly newer infrastructure. That's not to say that there aren't local pockets of issues like that, but we do have a really important challenge with a number of water quality issues, harmful algal blooms, nutrients, salinity, increasingly things that like PFAS that are sort of an emerging contaminant.
As Florida's population continues to grow, Dr. Cohen believes that the challenges associated with water resource management will continue to evolve as well.
There's a lot of people who have drinking straws in the ground, sucking water out of the Floridan aquifer, and trying to balance that resource consumption with conservation and with the various different sort of competing uses, I think is a real challenge. And we're very fortunate in the state to have a governance model that invests in a set of state institutions or our water management districts the authority to make decisions about the consumptive use of water that are trying to navigate towards a more perfect version of Florida where those resource needs are balanced. Obviously, it's often messy, but I think, it is a really important piece of the governance structure in the state. And so water supply is going to continue to be a major grand challenge in the state because people are moving to the state, because our built infrastructure is altering the hydrologic cycle in important ways, and because everybody that moves to Florida has an expectation that the water that, when they turn on the tap, it's going to be high quality, abundant. It's not something they have to think about a lot.
When it comes to long-term challenges, water quality is also something Floridians have to consider.
We have many, many examples where the water quality across the state is degrading or at least stubbornly not responding to efforts to try to remedy big issues like the Caloosahatchee Estuary or the Indian River Lagoon or our springs represent, I think, a sort of existential values trade-off between protecting environmental quality and engaging in the sort of economic enterprise that is also critically important to the state. And that involves things like food sovereignty. Where do we grow food? Do we grow food in Florida, or do we want to outsource food production elsewhere? And I think the answer to that is a values question. It's a policy question, and it has a really significant impact on the way we think about managing water quality.
Dr. Cohen also pointed out the potential impacts that would be associated with anything that changes the rate of evaporation.
By making the land warmer, making the air warmer, we're going to accelerate evaporation. Evaporation, water that evaporates is sort of by definition and by sort of the conservation of mass law is now water not available for other things. It doesn't rehydrate the aquifer. It doesn't rehydrate wetlands. It doesn't become water supply for people.
This change in the water balance is concerning, because we have based our decision-making on an assumed amount of water available.
Other impacts could include cascading consequences due to sea level rise.
Sea level is the boundary condition for the edge of the aquifer. As that rises, there's opportunities, particularly where fresh water has been extracted along the coast, for that salt water to start to make its way inland. And there was a very famous example of that a couple years ago in Cedar Key, where all of the supply wells became salty. And that future is not that far off for a number of coastal municipalities that are dependent on somewhat more fragile parts of the Floridan aquifer that sit along the coast. And so climate change is going to just change the way that we think about the water resources in the state. And it's going to force us into some really challenging decisions about how we allocate those resources. The other thing that I think is an emerging problem is this whole constellation of water quality challenges that are sort of emerging from our increased understanding of the way that humans are impacted by things that are in the water. That is something that I think we are really just now, coming to grips with.
These other water quality challenges include the health and ecosystem impacts of harmful algal blooms and other contaminants, such as forever chemicals like those on your nonstick cookware.
If you're asking yourself, well, why should I care? According to Dr. Cohen, the answer is simple.
To me, the most salient point is that there is no part of your life as a Floridian that isn't somehow connected with this conversation that's happening in sort of specialist circles about like what constitutes the appropriate or sustainable amount of water to remove from the aquifer. At what point have we exceeded that threshold? How do we take responsibility for that and dial back that? I think anybody who recreates outside, anybody who's ever taken a shower, anybody who eats food grown in Florida has contributed to the collective, the social challenge of trying to manage water. And insofar as Floridians love the place that they live, they love the beaches that they recreate on, they love the lakes that they kayak on, they love the springs, they love the Everglades, right? So insofar as people love those things, and I think it's fair to say that anybody who spent any time outside in Florida develops some affinity for those places. That's why ecotourism is such a big part of the conversation. But that creates a stewardship mandate. That means that we're having to navigate between a number of different competing priorities. And so I think that it's a problem that you can't lean away from. right? It touches everything.
I think it's great because we talk about these concepts of wicked problems all the time in classes. Now, you're dealing with these systems that water just runs the thread through, from eating to the economy to the ecosystem. What are some of the challenges and complexities with trying to address these issues that you've discussed?
I'll say that I think we can sort the water problems into the ones that are almost certainly solvable, even in the short term, and the ones that are much more vexing, and they have this Gordian knot feel where it's almost impossible to pull on any piece of that problem and not start influencing other parts of the problem that was sort of unforeseen.
Fortunately, Dr. Cohen says that many of Florida's water quantity challenges fall into the solvable category.
One of the sort of unheralded pieces of good news in the context of Floridians' water consumption is that peak water use in the state was somewhere between 1995 and 2000. And so since that's not per capita, that's total water use. And so total water use has actually declined in the last 20 or 25 years in response to narratives about and incentives for water conservation.
Water quality issues are harder to address, in part because the results are not as immediately obvious.
If we make changes to water supply today, like if we think about how we individually use water both directly and indirectly, and by indirectly, I mean when you make a decision to buy a product, there's a certain invested water in that product it's not in the product anymore, but it was necessary to make that product. And I think as consumers have become more savvy about the things that they buy and more inspired by sort of a stewardship ethos, that we note that the water consumption goes down, and the consequences of reduced water consumption across all sectors we see like immediately. It doesn't take very long for the consequences of our actions to be realized, and we can be happy about it and we can note the progress. Water quality is a much more complicated problem because the consequences of decisions that were made 30, 40, 50 years ago are what we're seeing today, right? So there's these legacy contaminant issues. So just to give an example, if we were to completely stop fertilizing anything in the Lake Okeechobee watershed, we would be looking at, by some estimates, 50 years of continued eutrophication issues in that lake.
According to Dr. Cohen, some of the most challenging aspects of water management in Florida have to do with a lack of understanding when it comes to emerging issues.
Where I think we're like most flying blind is that we don't, generally speaking, deal very well with the uncertainty of just not knowing. So how is sea level rise going to exacerbate some of our coastal salinity issues? How is PFAS contamination going to alter the viability of the Floridan aquifer, for example, to water supply? Those kinds of issues are often taking us by surprise. They become sort of emergency management where we're not well equipped to think systemically about how to respond.
But it's not all bad news. Already areas of Florida have taken steps towards solutions.
One especially good piece of news is that by virtue of a public-private consortium of collaborators, nitrogen loading to Sarasota Bay has declined. And seagrass coverage in Sarasota Bay has increased. And that's in spite of the fact that the population boom in that watershed has been really pretty dramatic. And so I think we need to understand, why did it work there and why is it not working in other places, and try to source solutions from evidence for some optimism.
I think it's very easy to get caught up in there's all this stuff and we can't do anything about it, but we do have to do something. And UF and the Water Institute are doing a lot. So can you talk a little bit about some of the projects or things that have happened at UF and the role that the Water Institute plays in coordinating these efforts?
Well, I'll start by saying that the University of Florida has been a global leader in water science solutions for a long time. Between the College of Agriculture's, the IFAS Extension Service, our investments from the College of Engineering, it's been a place that has been on the national and international map with regard to water for ages. The Water Institute exists in part because that expertise, that excellence doesn't have a center. Right? It's distributed across many colleges and many departments within colleges. And there was a sentiment back in the mid-2000s that was actually a liability, that Florida as an institution was unable to really advertise its excellence more broadly with federal donors, with international stakeholders, with peers across the country, because we didn't centralize our efforts in any way. The Water Institute was born out of a sort of grassroots, organic, bottom-up initiative to try to really advertise how good we were across this campus in terms of thinking about water solutions.
Like Dr. Cohen said, The UF Water Institute is not associated with any one college, which makes a lot of sense because most of these topics don't fall into any one area of expertise.
We seek to be more interdisciplinary, right? The interdisciplinarity of it doesn't stop when a geologist talks to an engineer. It should be when that geologist and engineer are talking with somebody who writes poetry. And I think that whole campus conversation about water, because it does touch every aspect of sort of the human enterprise, I think is where the Water Institute's missions come from. So what do? We mostly try to catalyze that conversation. That conversation is often about research projects. It's an effort to try to build collaborations across teams of people that might not have otherwise easily found each other. Most of the problems, I think the sort of wicked problems, are not going to be solved by a discipline coming to a solution. These solutions are multifaceted inherently. And so in recognizing that, the Water Institute is trying to be a catalyst for research and programming that builds that conversation.
One example of a UF Water Institute project that accomplished this is Facets. We'll discuss this project in depth later on in our Florida agriculture episode, but essentially, Facets brought together Florida stakeholders to discuss the conservation of Florida's natural resources, primarily the aquifer.
And that conversation is hard to broker. It's hard to have in an earnest way because it often is one group or the other essentially talking to from the platform to the rest of the people. And so one of the I think, very innovative and effective roles that the Water Institute played was to broker that conversation in a way that built trust, where that conversation wasn't the academics going to talk to everybody about what solutions they ought to adopt. It was really receiving from everybody what are the priorities and what are the questions and what constitutes the sort of bleeding edge of our knowledge that is constraining decision making. And that project, I think, was persuasive in that regard because it created conversations that are urgently needed, where stakeholders felt listened to, they felt they were participating in that discourse, and therefore they felt like the solutions were co-produced. They were co-produced by everybody, and that, I think, enables them to feel much more inspired by enabling those solutions. And a lot of times it sort of forces compromise. It forces conversations that you have to be pragmatic. You can't be dogmatic about your solutions.
To conclude, it doesn't matter who you are or what you do. You can be a part of the solution.
Finding pragmatic solutions and brokering conversations is a big part of the Water Institute's mission.
This season is going to be all about highlighting the value of these interdisciplinary approaches to challenges and opportunities.
Those opportunities include collaboration across UF and beyond. If you want to start learning more, you can visit the UF Water Institute website for more information, linked in the bio.
If you've made it this far, you've finished the entire episode, and we thank you for that. Tune in next time for more food for thought. Thanks again for joining us on this episode of FRE Lunch. We hope you'll come back again for seconds.